This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 701 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thank you for tuning in. Before getting into the transactions this week, I want to remind you that Twisted Tea and FanDuel have joined forces to bring you a one-of-a-kind contest series that gives you a chance to compete for your share of thousands of dollars in site credit. Introducing Twisted Tea's College Football Picks, a sports betting-focused contest series that's entirely free to play. The contest is simple. Each college football game will be assigned money line, spread, and total markets with assigned points to each market. All you have to do is make 6 selections based on those 3 markets and earn points for each correct selection you made. If at the end of the day your score ranks among the best in the contest, you'll be eligible for your share of site credit. Head over to fanduel.com/twistedtpicks and make your picks. And remember, please drink responsibly. Sell D'Onta Foreman. Now, your league might be pretty competitive. It might be filled with league managers who consume a ton of fantasy content. And they know not to just look at the final stat line when buying or selling players. But in more casual leagues, if you do look at that final stat line, D'Onta Foreman looks pretty attractive right now. Because in Week 8, he ran 26 times for 118 yards and 3 scores. He was a high-end RB1. He had almost 32 PPR points scored. He scored more points than any other Panthers running back this year. That includes, of course, Christian McCaffrey. But there are a lot of things to note here. First off, the Panthers faced the Falcons. Atlanta has one of the worst defensive units in football, and they were banged up. The Panthers ended up scoring 4 touchdowns, and D'Onta Foreman had 3 of them. Not only should we not expect the Panthers to have 4 offensive touchdowns per game moving forward, but Foreman's not going to have 75% of them. The other thing to note, Chuba Hubbard was out. I said this last week, but I do think that Foreman is a better player than Chuba Hubbard. But Foreman was at a sub 40% snap share before Hubbard was injured back in Week 7. I do think that moving forward, given what we saw this past week, Foreman's going to be the 1A in that backfield. It's just that a healthy Chuba Hubbard is a greater threat to Foreman's workload than Spencer Brown and Raheem Blackshear. And the Panthers don't have the best schedule in the world upcoming either, though they do get to face Atlanta one more time over the next few weeks. I do think that Foreman overall will still have some use in fantasy football. Like I just said, I think that he's going to see more work than Chuba Hubbard given what he did in Week 8. I just think that objectively, this is the kind of player to sell. If there's someone buying high. It's a bad offense. There's a running back that's going to come back and take some touches. And it was one of the best matchups imaginable on paper for D'Onta Foreman this past week. So if someone's buying this performance, I think that Foreman's a sell. Buy Devontae Smith. So since Week 1, Devontae Smith's averaged a target share per game of 26%. He's had 7.8 targets per game. During this same time frame, A.J. Brown's target share per game is 30%. It's only 4 percentage points higher. A.J. Brown's been at 8.5 targets per game, and like I said, Devontae Smith, 7.8. I bet those numbers are a little bit closer than you expected. And what's kind of crazy is that from weeks 2 through 6, so we're removing what happened this past week, and we're removing Week 1. From weeks 2 through 6, Devontae Smith had more receiving yards than A.J. Brown. Since that Week 1 goose egg, Smith's actually been really good in fantasy. He's averaged over 15 PPR points per game. And that includes a very mediocre 7.3 point outing against Pittsburgh this past week. The production was not there, but the volume was. He still had a 27% target share. The Eagles' offense continues to cook. I want Devontae Smith on my fantasy team. Hold Justin Fields. So we all know that Justin Fields had a pretty tough start to the season. So you see what he did this past week, and you're probably wondering, is this sustainable? Over his last 4 contests, Justin Fields has been a top 12 QB1 in each one. So my answer is to hold tight. He's averaged about 2 more rush attempts per game across his last 4 compared to his first 4. And in this split, he's been roughly 33 more rushing yards per game better. That's almost an additional passing touchdown per contest in standard scoring leagues. And the great part is his schedule is looking nice. Chicago's next 3 matchups are against teams that rank in the bottom half of the league in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. They get the Dolphins, Lions, and Falcons. There was a reason a couple of weeks ago I talked about adding Justin Fields. He's likely going to be a plug-and-play option over the next few weeks. Add Josh Palmer. So despite the fact that we were told that Mike Williams is set to miss at least 4 weeks with this injury, Josh Palmer is still available in almost 80% of Yahoo leagues. So make sure you add him this week. Without Williams, Palmer is going to be slotted as a starter on the perimeter for LA. Keenan Allen should be back and healthy this week, hopefully, fingers crossed. But Allen moves around that formation. He'll play in the slot a little bit. Palmer's more of a perimeter guy. He's more of a one-to-one replacement for Mike Williams. Now, I understand Palmer had an opportunity to step up earlier this year with Keenan Allen's injury. That didn't totally work out. He hasn't given us a top 20 wide receiver performance this season. But with that being said, he's seen a target share at or above 17% in 4 of 6 games played. That's not bad in a Justin Herbert-led offense. Sell Jonathan Taylor. So I had no idea entering this week's transactions that I would be talking about Jonathan Taylor. Usually I have some idea about who I'm going to talk about. But with Jonathan Taylor, it wasn't even a thought in my mind. But when I do this show, I try to look at how the industry might be viewing players. I try to look at what the market might be saying. And Jonathan Taylor is still ranked really high in rest of season rankings across the industry. And I get it. You spent the first overall pick to get Taylor, more than likely. He was so good last year. He is a very good running back. But what makes him more attractive right now than someone like Josh Jacobs, or even Dalvin Cook, or maybe even Travis Etienne? Here are the facts. Taylor's given you one top 20 performance this entire season in PPR formats. That came all the way back in week 1. Since then, he's averaged a running back rush share per game of 78.6% and a target share per game just shy of 10%. Now, I know he hasn't been fully healthy this season, but those numbers are essentially the exact same that he saw last year. The difference is that the Colts offense isn't nearly as good. They're putting points on the scoreboard on just 30.7% of their drives this year. That number was over 43% last year. Last season, about 27% of their drives resulted in a touchdown. This year, it's under 14%. The main reason Jonathan Taylor was so incredible for fantasy last year was touchdowns. And of course, the better the offense, the more scoring opportunities a player is going to see. Last season, the Colts led the NFL in plays run at the goal line. They averaged 3.6 of those plays per game. In 2022, that number is a full play lower. Are we really expecting this huge turnaround with the Colts offense? They've already moved on from their starting quarterback. Now they have a more mobile passer under center. Historically, that's not been a great thing for running backs or wide receivers and tight ends. Taylor's not someone who's going to disappear. He's not a Najee Harris type. But like I said, judging by some of the rest of season rankings that I see out there, you can still get a very, very nice return for Jonathan Taylor right now. Sometimes you have to sell a little bit low. And for the record, at the time of this recording, Nyheim Hines, there are rumors out there that he's going to get moved. If he gets traded, of course, that's a little bit of a boost for Jonathan Taylor. But I would still use that in trade negotiations to get a good deal for him. Because the whole market will be higher on Jonathan Taylor if Nyheim Hines does get traded. Hold Courtland Sutton. It's been rough for Courtland Sutton. From weeks 1 through 5, Sutton was averaging a target share per game of 29%. His PPR points per game average was 15.4. He wasn't giving you monster weeks, but he was consistent as Russell Wilson's top target. In the 3 games since then, Sutton's target share per game has dropped to 15.8%. He's failed to reach 6 PPR points in a single contest. I don't think trading away right now at such a low point is a good idea, especially before a bye week. The good news is that once their bye week is over, their schedule's pretty favorable. They have plus matchups from weeks 10 through week 14. That's according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. So just hold tight and hope the Broncos can just turn things around during this bye week. Add Greg Dulcich. So I mentioned Dulcich a couple of weeks ago, and his usage has been awesome. It needs to be reiterated. He's played 3 NFL games, and in those games, he's seen target shares of 12%, 20%, and 19%. As a rookie tight end. And meanwhile, during this time, he's second in the NFL in tight end routes run. Fewer teams are going to be looking for Dulcich off the waiver wire this week because the Broncos are on a bye. I think that he's worth a stash and holding through that bye week. Buy Raheem Mostert. So Mostert's now given us 2 single-digit PPR performances over his last 3. That's going to frustrate fantasy managers. But usage-wise, things are okay. He hasn't seen fewer than 70% of Miami's running back rushes in a single game since week 3, and he's consistently running the most routes out of that backfield. And I talked about Mostert a couple of weeks ago on this show because the Dolphins have a favorable schedule moving forward. That schedule hasn't changed. From now through the end of the season, according to my adjusted fantasy points allowed method, Miami has the best running back schedule in the entire NFL. So now is not the time to bail on Raheem Mostert. Add Jaylen Warren. So this transaction has two purposes. The first one, it's not a bad idea to add handcuffs right now. And the handcuff doesn't have to be for a running back on your roster. You don't need to add Jaylen Warren only if you have Najee Harris. Because if something happens to Harris or if a shift happens in that Steelers backfield, then all of a sudden you'd have another usable piece if Warren was on your roster. Now there are times to handcuff your own running backs too. If you're in really, really good shape, if you're looking good for the playoffs, you can have that insurance policy. It makes total sense. So add handcuffs right now. But the second reason this transaction exists is because Najee Harris has been very bad. According to Number Fire's expected points model, Harris has a 32% success rate this year. Jaylen Warren is at 48%. Harris has a per rush expected points added rate of minus 0.12. Warren is at plus 0.34. Now, this isn't to say that Warren is a better running back than Najee Harris. It is to say that Harris probably shouldn't be seeing the amount of work that he's been seeing. He has not been effective. And we saw a shift in week 8. Warren hit a career and season high 43% running back rush share. Go get your handcuffs. Sell Tua Tagovailoa. Look, there's nothing wrong with Tua. Honestly, if he was my fantasy quarterback, I would feel fine. This transaction is for those of you who are looking at the playoffs. In week 15, Miami gets Buffalo. We know that's a tough matchup for quarterbacks. It's a top 5 one. The following week, it's Green Bay, another top 5 opponent in the wrong direction. And then during championship week, the Dolphins get the Patriots. New England hasn't been a tough matchup on paper, but if you look at what they did in week 1, they held Tua to under 15 fantasy points. So given Tua's coming off this monster performance in a really easy matchup, now might be the time to sell. Add Isaiah Likely. So Mark Andrews is banged up. And in that Thursday night game against Tampa Bay, Isaiah Likely, he crushed. He had 6 receptions, 77 yards, and a touchdown. He had a 20.6% target share. It sounds like Mark Andrews' injury isn't overly serious, but there's at least some chance that he misses some time. So Likely is someone to add off the waiver wire this week, just in case. Add Kenyon Drake. Another Raven to add off the wire this week is Kenyon Drake. It feels like deja vu. Gus Edwards, he's hurt again. He hurt his hamstring against the Buccaneers. That leaves us with Drake as the team's lead back, or at least the player who's likely to see the most touches in that backfield. Drake has had a couple of decent performances over his last 3, and he saw a season-high 11.8% target share in week 8. With Baltimore's bye week hitting in week 10, they might be more inclined to give their injured players a rest this week against the Saints. So this goes for Mark Andrews and Gus Edwards. That's another reason to look at Drake off the waiver wire. Buy James Robinson. Of all the transactions you're going to hear this week, this is 100% the strangest. It's at least the most galaxy-brained one. Now, as we all know, Robinson was traded to the Jets last week after Breece Hall's ACL injury. In week 8, J-Rob only saw 36% of New York's running back rushes. He had just 1 target through the air. Michael Carter was the guy who played the most snaps. Now, that was to be expected because James Robinson had just joined the team. And the fact that the Jets hit a negative game script, that favors Michael Carter more than James Robinson. And look, I've talked about it on this show plenty this season. James Robinson has struggled this year. He has not been good. This is why he was a sell candidate for me earlier this season. But he is likely going to be the primary early down and goal line guy for New York. And if any of you guys had Breece Hall, cover your ears. Jets running backs have the 3rd best playoff schedule this year in fantasy football. They get the Lions, who are the 2nd best matchup in adjusted points allowed to running backs, the Jags, who are 7th, and the Seahawks, who are 9th. That's from weeks 15 through 17. And those are all winnable games for the Jets, too. That could lead to more favorable game scripts for a player like James Robinson. Now, I have to stress this. Do not send anything substantial for James Robinson. This is just a scenario where you're swapping bench assets. Because there's a non-zero chance that we see decent production from the Jets' backfield during the fantasy playoffs this year. I know it's a random transaction, but I do think that it's kind of logical. Add the Cincinnati Bengals defense. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, the Bengals are 8.5-point home favorites this week against the Panthers. Carolina's looked better with PJ Walker under center the last couple of weeks, but we have to keep in mind they faced a struggling Bucs team, and then they faced the Falcons. And the Falcons were still a top 10 defense against them. Carolina's been the 8th most favorable matchup this season for opposing defenses in adjusted fantasy points allowed. I think you should have confidence in the Bengals defense this week. Buy the Baltimore Ravens defense. So you're probably sitting there like, wait, there's another transaction after you already talked about a defense? Yes, and it's a weird one, another weird one. We're going to trade for a defense this week. The Ravens might be out there on some waiver wires, but they're likely rostered in your league. If you're getting frustrated with the constant cycling of defenses each week, you could look to Baltimore. They have a shot to be a plug-and-play option over the rest of the season. Seriously. Now keep in mind, they do have a bye in Week 10. But check out this schedule through the rest of the year. New Orleans, Carolina, Jacksonville, Denver, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Atlanta, Pittsburgh. And their Week 16 and 17 games against the Falcons and Steelers, they're at home. Don't sleep on the Ravens defense from here on out. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. Remember to check out lateround.com, join the Patreon, subscribe to the newsletter, all that good stuff. Otherwise, I'll talk to you tomorrow. Take care.